his race. I am determined, if there are 3 or 4 young Armenians in America of this sort, that they shall not be destroyed by the mob, because these men will resurrect the great Armenia, the Armenia which nothing can efface from the earth and from life, the Armenia that I know and am and love. I know I shall be reprimanded by men older than myself, and I welcome their criticisms without fear and without bitterness. I speak for myself, for the Armenia I have discovered in myself, nourished and brought to life. I speak for the great Armenia, and if there is a lesser Armenia, I refuse to acknowledge it. I refuse to be of it, since it is not the Armenia I know and love, the Armenia I am seeking to perpetuate. Beside the force of commitment in this statement to an Armenian identity, one is once again struck by the insistence on the individual as the bearer of the ethos of the people, and the individual as one who, in a sense, is opposed to the collective mass. In Saroyan's later years, the Fresno and Paris years of the 1960s and 70s, some early habits were slowly shed, others very much strengthened. Notorious as a big gambler with instant losses as high as $50,000, Saroyan weaned himself of that habit. The major salutary consequence was the gradual accumulation of royalties and advances which had never stopped from his many and early successes. In the 1970s, both smoking and drinking were also abandoned. A new routine and discipline was enforced and more or less stuck to. A discipline whose main aim was to ensure regular writing. Saroyan was always able to work hard and swiftly. With divorce well behind him, his children now adults, with finances and living arrangements secure in Paris, Fresno, and San Francisco, Saroyan was poised in these last 2 decades to turn his efforts to completing the hundreds of ideas he had accumulated. He became a workaholic. The output of these years remains almost entirely in typescript. A few published plays, stories and essays, a half a dozen volumes of memoirs may seem like a great deal for a normal writer to have published in this period, but for William Saroyan it represents a fraction of the actual work produced since the appearance of his bibliography in 1964 by David Kouymjian, and the only book-length study devoted to Mr. Saroyan by Flown in the following year. When the manuscripts of this final period are studied, they will reveal a man who, while maintaining his humor and wonderment toward the world, had become an earnest and untiring inquirer into the meaning of the human experience. Much of this time was spent with Armenians, whether in the summers in Paris or in the winters in Fresno. Much of his writing then was directed and directly about Armenians and their problems. I cannot comment on the contents of the following works, which seem, at least by their titles, to encompass Saroyan's ethnic background, for I simply have not had access to them. But their titles may be instructive. These are all from the later period. The plays, the following play: An Imaginary Character named William Saroyan. Another play, Home to Hayastan. Another play, The Young Brothers Karamanouganian. Or the very provocative Uzenk Chuzenk Hayenk, a play which he has indicated should be performed in Armenian. Saroyan did not write Armenian, but he spoke Armenian, and what I suspect is that we have here something in transliteration. I have 5 minutes. I will take probably 7. However, I have been privy to a number of plays which Saroyan passed on to me and which he referred to as his Armenian plays. They were given to me for possible use in my regular courses on the writing of Saroyan. The play Haraj, which I shall refer to, was specifically offered for a class assignment in one of those classes in which Saroyan wanted to see how both American and Armenian and non-Armenian audiences, college-level students and adults, would react to this play. 3 of these unpublished plays deal exclusively with the Armenian condition. The earliest, chronologically, is The Armenians, written in 1972, and the only one of the 3 which has been either published or performed. It was performed at the diocese in 1975 under the direction of Ed Saroyan, and maybe some of you saw that production. The other 2 plays that I will be discussing is one entitled Bitlis of 1975, and the one I've already just alluded to, Haraj of 1979. The Armenians of 1972 is an historical play. Its action takes place in 1920 in Fresno, California, at the moment that the independent Armenian Republic is replaced by the Soviet one. The 3 principal characters, an apostolic Armenian priest and 2 Protestant ministers, one Armenian Congregational and the other Armenian Presbyterian, debate and argue Armenia's fate and the individual destiny of Armenians in exile. The action begins in a church hall, but moves quickly to the coffee house. Many would judge Saroyan's treatment of the clergyman cavalier, if not downright irreverent. Other characters in this play include a maverick Armenian doctor and native inhabitants of Van, Mush, Harput, Erzurum, and Diyarbakir, who are otherwise unnamed. Collectively, they represented the massacred and disinherited nation. A humorous fatalism runs throughout the play, with the suggestion that if, at the moment, these notables from California can't help Armenia, they should at least attend to their own lives. I quote from the play, "Can we help our brothers in Armenia? Apparently we can't. Well, then hadn't we better see about helping ourselves and one another and our children and our friends and our neighbors and even our worst enemies?" Saroyan says, almost frivolously, in the program notes he prepared for the 1975 production, I quote, "Some of the playwright's observations are both from before 1920 and long after. The play, The Armenians, perhaps says, the Armenian struggle is hopeless, and we know it. But not so hopeless, we don't want to find out how hopeless it is." Already in that same spring of 1975, when Bitlis was being performed in New York, when The Armenians was being performed in New York, Saroyan wrote a play entitled Bitlis. He wrote it, he was in Paris, he wrote it in Paris. He had always considered the place of birth of his mother and father and his 2 sisters as really his own hometown. He was, in the Armenian way of saying it, at Bitlis. In the mid-30s, he had already written a short story with that title, which presents his long-dead father walking through the streets of Bitlis. It is a story in which his uncle Setrak recalls that his father, Armenak Saroyan, in Bitlis, walking on the street one evening, used a most expressive, forlorn, and mournful Armenian expression, "Ah, ah," and that's all he used to say, "Ah, ah," which was to have great meaning to Saroyan all his life. This was a true story, apparently, and indeed is the title of one of his most interesting paintings, a painting made in 1974 with the title Ah, Ah, Hayastan. The play, Bitlis, describes the journey Saroyan made with 2 other Armenians. Saroyan had never written about or at least never published anything, and indeed claimed to have been unable to do so. Yet some years after the trip, he composed a very long poem in quatrains. I believe I've seen that poem, and he mentions it in a moment later. For all of Saroyan's life, Bitlis nestled in his imagination as the living source of his being. The journey of Bitlis must have been mythical and more symbolic. There he must have thought he would find both his lost nation, representing his original ethnic identity, and perhaps also his father, the poet, minister, farmer, who had abandoned him at age 3 by dying. But why did Saroyan only articulate his impressions of Bitlis a decade after he went there? I now believe that it was due to the effect on him of Michael Arlen's book, Passage of Ararat, which, as you may remember, came out as a New York profile in February of 1975, the same spring that he wrote Bitlis. Saroyan admired the book unconditionally. In an October 24, 1975 letter to James Kouymjian, he says, I quote, "What he, Michael Arlen, has done in Passage to Ararat could not have been done by anybody else in the whole world or in all of the dimensions and channels of sequential time. It had to be Dickran Kouymjian's puzzled son with a totally different personality, style, talent, and aspiration. We are all of us lucky it happened, for these things need luck." And Michael Arlen's name, as you know, is the same as mine, and his father's name was Dickran Kouymjian, no relation. In the play, Bitlis, there is a more pensive spirit than in the earlier work, The Armenians, when it comes to basic questions such as the experience of returning to your hometown and witnessing the reality of its total estrangement from the Armenian reality. To its present Kurdish inhabitants, the Armenianness of the town is at best historical. To Saroyan, it must have been so painful that uncharacteristically he could not write about it immediately. And when he did, it was in highly rationalized and stoic terms. Michael Arlen's penetrating insistence on plunging deeper and deeper into his own individual psyche, in a sense an existential approach to being Armenian, is probably the determinant inspiration in Saroyan's own passage to Bitlis as worked out in his play. What may prove to be Saroyan's final serious statement on the Armenian condition is found in his 1979 play Harach. It is by far the most serious and longest of the 3 plays considered in this paper. The name is taken from the Paris Armenian daily, often frequented by Saroyan. Its editorial offices were a short walk from the writer's flat on Rue Taitbo. The work is neither historical nor autobiographical, but strictly an idea play, one which uses dramatic speech didactically as it was used by Plato in the Socratic dialogues. I have already suggested that Harach, the play, was modeled on the dialogue, the Symposium, its subject being Armenian existence rather than love. In this work, written less than 2 years before Saroyan's death, he refers to his trip to Bitlis. Saroyan, from the play I'm quoting. "There was only one Armenian in Bitlis, the rest were Kurds, and I found that they seemed to be not only Armenians, that they were Saroyan. When I got back to Fresno, I didn't know where to start, and in the end, the only thing I wrote was a kind of a poem called Bitlis, but it does not really tell what is in my heart to tell, which I don't really know how to tell. For the old Armenian only asked us to please get him to Beirut so that he could die among Armenians. It is a difficult thing to make sense of loss and absence and displacement and destruction. But whoever is alive in a place, he is the owner of the place. That is the law of history, and Bitlis is gone. And I wish I knew how it might be brought back to us. But Saroyan had written about his trip 4 years earlier in the play I had just quoted. And in that play of 1975, he says this, and now I'm quoting from Bitlis. "I find myself deeply saddened to be leaving the place, but also glad to have it behind me. I had to come, I had to see it. I came, I saw it. I am saddened by it. I am glad to be leaving it, but there is more. There is something nagging me, and I don't know what it is. What is it?" And another character in the play, Bedros Zobian, the editor of Marmara, says, "It's quite simple. It is simply that the place was ours for so long, it was yours for so long, it was the home of the Armenians and the Saroyans for so long, And even though you were born far away from it, you were really still here, as if you had been born and had lived here, and you came back and everything was in ruins and even in doubt. As we read through Bitlis and Harach, as we read Bitlis, remember the author is a famous man of American letters, whose works are praised for capturing the quintessence of American life of the late Depression and the Second World War. In these Armenian works, Saroyan provides for himself a vehicle through which he could present his most intimate reflections on living the life of an Armenian in exile. In his final statement on Armenians, he offers to his countrymen, both diasporic like himself, and for those ethnically secure in their homeland, a guide to their ethnicity. In Harach, this very wordy play of a very prolix talker and writer, there are a remarkable series of discussions. By the very setting, an editorial office, a place of constant dissemination, Saroyan emphasizes the importance of the printed word in Armenian life and the need to broadcast the very messages of this play. The broad sampling of Armenian types in the play, a priest, a French-Armenian poet, a female editor, an old man from Bitlis, a Soviet-Armenian writer, an American-Armenian professor, serves to recreate Armenia itself. The device was already used by Saroyan in 1951 in his novel Vagram, which takes place in part in the offices of Asparez in Fresno. In that scene, too, Saroyan takes time to discuss the ethnic destiny of his nation. The play Harach symbolically brings together the remnants of a dispersed Armenian nation in the same way an Armenian newspaper reduces the physical isolation of a diasporic people. Throughout Harach, identity questions are posed for discussion. They are answered by Saroyan existentially through the voices of his very characters. For him, these questions and the very definition of identity, ethnic identity, can only properly be understood existentially. Saroyan says, quote, "I always believed I was free to be the kind of Armenian, the kind of self I have become. And while you might feel I shouldn't have bothered, I confess I had no choice. I had to bother. And that also is Armenian." I'm going to skip a section here because I'm being pressured. Well, no, I'm not. Zulal, the poet in the play, underlines the notion. Why is an Armenian? Where is an Armenian? What is an Armenian? When is an Armenian? And the answer is this. An Armenian is a Turk who says, I am an Armenian. It is a decision open to all people, and only Armenians have ever wanted to be Armenians. Everyone else has not made a decision, but has gone right on being whatever it was he believed he was. You have got to choose to be an Armenian. You have got to want to be an Armenian. Yet here, as in most of Saroyan's previous writing, the Armenian story is only interesting insofar as it reflects the human story. It is the universality of the Armenian condition that gives it immediacy and nobility. Harachia, another character in the play, says, I am sure we have all read it in at least 2 or 3 books by 2 or 3 writers. Everybody is Armenian. Is that not so, Saroyan? Did you not say so somewhere? And Saroyan answers in the play, oh yes, I did. I was informed, however, that a Jewish writer had said the same thing a year or 2 before I had done so. He said, and how right he was, everybody is a Jew. In other words, everybody is everybody else. And if that has no scientific merit, it certainly does not have any kind of demerit. It is a fact. My conclusions here. My purpose in quoting at such length Saroyan's words expressed over half a century, is to impress on those interested just how fundamental Saroyan's ethnicity was to his identity. His national origin was something solid for him, a secure refuge, always there when his relationship with the world beyond became fragile, always a wellspring of energy and creativity. It might be argued that Saroyan never felt totally at ease in his native America. I repeat again that he certainly never assimilated. But even his integration into the American mainstream may have never been thorough. The tenacity with which William Saroyan clung to his ethnic identity can only be explained by his understanding that being Armenian, comprehending that condition with all its trauma and richness, its struggles and joys, and then affirming it was nothing less than a universal exercise. He tried, through the persuasion of his writing, to show others, especially his countrymen, the reality of that concept. For him, ethnic identity was a uniting of a rich historical past with a continuing present in anticipation of a firmly rooted future. For him, it was simply being fully human. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dickran. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall have questions at the end of the session on all the preceding papers and on Dr. Rand's. We will now break and reconvene in 5 minutes at the other end of the corridor.
Give us a little more time. Say 10 minutes.
Oh, all right, 10 minutes, but not much more than that.
We have to reset everything.
Thanks and profound appreciation to all of the speakers who have participated in this very historic 3-day conference on the Armenian experience in America. Those of you who have attended one or more of the sessions have, I'm sure, been impressed with the effort and quality of the papers which have been presented. We know how much time these participants have spent in preparing these papers, and no amount of words can really express our appreciation for the effort that they have put in. They have done it out of the goodness of their heart. There has been no financial remuneration that they are getting. They have done it also for the purpose of helping further the understanding of the Armenian community in America, its settlement, its problems, its future. And we in NAASR feel privileged to have had this opportunity to bring these scholars together in this first conference of this kind ever in America, and the first conference of this kind ever in the Armenian diaspora. And as I said the other night, I hope that this is just the beginning, that on a periodic basis of every few years, there will be further conferences of this type in order to investigate many, many other aspects of Armenian community life in America. But the bottom line of what I'm trying to say now is that none of this would be possible without the kind of support that we've been getting from the members of the organization, and particularly from those who have made financial contributions. If you look in the back of the program, and I don't have one, may I borrow yours, Gorky? On the back of the program, for those of you who have it, you will notice the name of several individuals who have responded generously to our appeal that they help underwrite partially the expenses of this conference. And so publicly I would like to acknowledge them. First and foremost, as a sponsor is Mr. and Mrs. Alex Manoog of Michigan, and then a group of patrons which include Mr. and Mrs. John Myrak of Arlington, Mr. and Mrs. Suren Pestjan of Pelham, Minor, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Mardigian of Birmingham, Michigan, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Berberian of Hillsborough, California, Mr. and Mrs. Peter Armenian of Winchester, Dr. and Mrs. Gregory Adamian of Waltham, Dr. and Mrs. Paul Bartham of Belmont, Mr. and Mrs. Saroyan of Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, Dr. and Mrs. Nikit Kouymjian of Fresh Meadows, New York, and one anonymous supporter. I'm sure there will be others who will be responding to our appeal, and at the end of all of this, we'll have a public acknowledgement of their support. So we are grateful to them. But all of you can play a role in ensuring that this type of activity continues. The role you can play is first and foremost as a member of this organization. If you are not already a member, I am extending an open invitation to all of you, each and every one of you here who is not a member, to become a member. Because your membership gives us the kind of support, the kind of encouragement, the kind of incentive to do the kinds of things that we have done over the last 30 years, and which we hope will carry on for the next 30 years and perhaps for the next 100 years or whatever it may be. Because the significant thing about the activities of NAASR is that most of them are the kinds of activities that will never, never die out. NAASR's financial support of Armenian studies is based on the concept of supporting endowment funds. And the whole concept of an endowment fund is permanence. And through the permanence of the programs that NAASR establishes, we can guarantee the permanence of interest and activity on behalf of the Armenian people, their history, their culture, their language, everything that constitutes Armenian, the word Armenian. And so, your membership, your financial support, your participation, if you have the time, will guarantee not only permanence, but will guarantee immortality for the Armenians. For what we do, through the kind of programs that NAASR develops and tries to move forward on, can never be taken away from the Armenians. These permanent programs through American universities across the country, once established, can never be taken away. No change of government, no revolution, no earthquake, no nothing can take these things away, because they are permanent. They become part of the work and work of every college and university, but these types of programs have been established. So you are guaranteeing really immortality for the Armenians. The Turks were able to take away our land, our lives, our churches, and everything else that we consider Armenian. But they'll never be able to take away the spirit. They'll never be able to take away the essence of what is Armenian. And this is the fundamental purpose for which NAASR is dedicated. So again, I come back and say we invite you to join us in this mission. This is our 30th anniversary year that we are starting, and we have many more decades of activity to undertake, and we cannot do it without everybody's support. After this next presentation, we'll have a reception in the next room. You're all cordially invited there to partake of wine and cheese and fruits and other things that we have for you. And those of you who would like to purchase books that deal with the subjects that have been discussed today particularly, as well as other days during this conference, you'll be able to purchase those also. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker in this afternoon's session is Dr. Harry Rand. I first met Harry more than 10 years ago when he was working on his PhD dissertation for the Department of Fine Arts here. His work then on Arshile Gorky's iconography laid the foundation for his important book, Arshile Gorky, The Implications of Symbols, which was published in 1982. After leaving Harvard, Harry taught at SUNY and then moved to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. He's now curator at the National Museum of American Art and chairman of the Department of 20th Century Painting and Sculpture. Dr. Rand has written a great deal on modern art and on modern artists, and is a contributing editor to Arts Magazine. We're very happy to welcome Harry Rand back to Harvard. He will speak to us on Arshile Gorky's Armenian sources.
Thank you. In front of an audience like this, that includes many experts in fairly arcane areas of Armenian studies, in an audience that is the largest Armenian, represents the largest Armenian community outside of Soviet Armenia, the largest Armenian community in the diaspora, and in a city with a large Armenian population, I address you, a man who knows nothing about Armenian history, except spotty areas that I need for my very specialized and narrow work. I know nothing about Armenian language. The occasional words of Armenian that I'll use will almost certainly be mispronounced. Last night, a word that I thought I knew, I was corrected upon. It turns out lavosh is lavash, which is my favorite breakfast food. I keep it in my freezer, and I've been mispronouncing it all these years. And I know my knowledge of Armenian culture is absolutely minimal, again, based on the requirements of my very specialized study. If I were in the audience, if I were one of you at this moment, I would be asking myself, what is this man doing there? In point of fact, I think that by looking at a very small segment of the Armenian diaspora, a highly specialized set of data, we can illuminate something of the potential of the Armenian culture as it represents material to be mined by immigrants, and not just those of genius, such as Gorky was. Turn the lights down. And turn the light up. Here we have first slide, please. Good. Now, let's see. No, you went backward. Now, you have to focus that. Yes, I don't have a focusing mechanism. Good, and you have to zoom out a bit, get it down. Rafi, can you zoom that back a bit so we can contract the image?
That's at the extreme.
Yes, but we want it smaller.
I can lower it.
That's it. Is that a zoom? That is a zoom lens, isn't it?
Yes.
Can you contract?
Going the wrong way.
Aha. That's it. Okay. Well, that's pretty good. What we're looking at is a self-portrait drawing of Arshile Gorky, done in 1935 in pencil. And the drawing itself, despite its gargantuan image there, is only 9 7/8 by 8 1/4 inches. In fact, it's just a little bit bigger than a luxury-sized postcard, which should give us some idea of the virtuosity that this man possessed with his mythically sharp pencils. And if we get time, we can talk about something of his technique, which is not terribly important. Oh, yes, yes. Oh, I forgot about that. That's right, the acoustics change with the projector. I'm now King Canute fighting back the waves of acoustics the projector sends out. We won't be talking too much about Gorky's technique because it's not terribly germane, but he was an intensely interesting character in terms of the evolution of his virtuosic technique. Gorky was of absolutely monumental importance in terms of the art history of the 20th century. And if we can argue on one hand that Saroyan is a figure of national importance in American literature and his stature has yet to be fully recognized, and if we can argue that Hovhannis's potential has not nearly been recognized, that isn't really the case with Gorky. He is one of the major pillars of 20th century painting and sculpture. He is a man who is inextricably woven up in the history of what will be modern art. He is sometimes thought of as the last surrealist, and indeed André Breton's support for him when Breton was in this country testifies to his place within the surrealist movement. He is also considered the first of the abstract expressionists, and de Kooning, Willem de Kooning, who just celebrated his 80th birthday last week, has given ample testimony to his discipleship, virtual discipleship to Gorky. It's indeed arguable that Gorky's career and contribution is seminal to what we think of as abstract expressionism and modern art in the United States. If we subtract his personality and groundbreaking effect, we might never have had the movement that we know in the form that we have it. He was actually born in 1904, Vazdanug Manoog, Vazdanug for the district of Van, and Manoog for his grandfather. His father was Sedrag Adoyan, and his mother was Shoshanig de Marderosian. He was born in the town of Hayat Zor on Lake Van, at Zor Chokhmvari. Thus settled in this small town as a youth on the shores of Lake Van, in the center of ancient religious life, Gorky spent his earliest years cradled amid a tight-knit family, but into this world of pastoral serenity, global events about which we all know too well, soon erupted with terrible consequence. To escape being drafted into the Turkish army, Gorky's father fled Armenia in 1908, and Sedrag had indeed correctly anticipated the gravity of the situation that was soon to betake Armenia. The Armenians, as you know, were forced conscripts of the Turks, and that was the fate that his father avoided. When Armenia was liberated, and I use that word with inverted commas, by the Russian forces under Grand Duke Nicholas, the Armenians were prevented from returning to their homes as part of a Russian scheme to colonize the area with Cossacks, and although Lenin subsequently declared the area independent and unified, the Soviet administration of Armenia offered little hope of a secure identity for its native people. Now, the specifics of this tragedy, which you all know far too well, I recount only to recall for us the specifics in which Gorky grew up, and the horror of these events remained fresh in his memory ever after. He had three sisters, Satanik, Akabi, and Vartush, and he grew up with them in this horrible circumstance. After their father's departure, the children were left to care for their mother, Shoshanig, a very beautiful woman whose favorite was Gorky. These special conditions produced an inevitable associations from his closeness as an only son to a mother who, though not a widow, was without a husband. And perhaps these associations were felt too deeply by the sensitive and susceptible boy, and producing a traumatic effect after the father's departure. Gorky's sister Satanik remembered that Gorky did not speak until the age of 5 or 6, and that his first word was a nonsense word that later became the title of a painting, Al-Qura, or Al-Qura. I'm not sure how that was pronounced. In 1920, he arrived in the United States and almost instantly began to assume the career of an artist, which I've always thought was a very peculiar choosing for a man to have come from such precarious circumstance to then choose a career which offered almost no hope of remuneration or indeed social stature. He worked for a short while at the Hood Rubber Factory, which I understand has just been demolished, and was quickly dismissed from his job for sketching on the shoe frames that he was supposed to be working with. He worked through, that is, assumed the assumptions of and painted from the assumptions of Impressionism and mimicked Monet and probably more closely Sisley, and then assumed the style of post-impressionism mimicking Cézanne. His mimicry of these artists is truly astonishing, painting works that more closely than any subsequent artist achieved the full style of the original master. He then assumed the style of Picasso. In 1925 he came to New York and very quickly made the transformation from a student to a teacher at the Grand Central School of Art within one term. I don't know of another person who's ever done anything like that. On his ascension to the faculty, he was interviewed by a New York paper, and he invented for himself the most remarkable biography, which bore little resemblance to his actual life. He claimed to have been a student of Kandinsky's, to have studied widely in Europe, none of which was true. Also, he claimed to have been a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, which he was not. It was about this time, and at about this time of the interview, that he changed his name from his Armenian name to Arshile Gorky. He claimed to be a cousin of the Russian writer Maxim Gorky, and of course therefore claimed to be a Russian. This gets very complicated because Maxim Gorky is also a pseudonym. So Maxim Gorky, whose real name was Alexei Pleshkov, could not have had a cousin named Arshile Gorky. In fact, so unsure was he of exactly who he wanted to become that we find in this period various spellings of his name on documents and paintings as he was sorting out how he wanted to present himself. And this problem of the artist, or rather the immigrant, creating the persona of the artist is one that threads all of Gorky's career. He seems to have been an immigrant boy who created the persona, the personality, the figure of a great artist who would then be capable of painting the paintings that the immigrant boy wished to paint. Early on, he used his family for the beginning of his stylistic evolution and examination. And when his family was not as he wished it to be, he would alter that as well. The work you see on the screen is the portrait of himself from 1923-1930, oil on cardboard, about 9 by 14 inches, with his imaginary wife. At the time he was not married, and so he used the occasion of his art to essay a fit spouse, to see what she might look like. This sort of fantasy, I think, those of us who are still not married engage in, and without becoming too arch, perhaps it's the sort of thing we engage in after we're married also, thinking about ideal spouses. I recall a line that I heard Henry Fonda use when he did his one-man show on Clarence Darrow, and he said, using Darrow's words, that getting married was like going to a restaurant with a friend. You order what you like, he orders what he likes, and then when the food comes, you wonder why you didn't get what he wanted. However, the critical image was not this one or any of the pictures that come from this period. The critical and the pivotal image in Gorky's career is based on an absolutely factual document, which was a photograph taken in 1912 of Gorky with his mother. His mother was one of the victims of the Armenian Holocaust, and so he arrived in this country an orphan. This picture was probably taken by an itinerant photographer. It's a standard photographer's backdrop that we see. And it was this image to which Gorky returned time and time and time again over a period of approximately 20 years, reworking the image as often as possible, using it as the vocabulary with which to make an artistic language that would advance modern art, ultimately a great deal further from what he had inherited. For example, and you're going to see only a minuscule sample of the number of works that derive from this photograph, this is a very small 8 by 6 pencil drawing without a date, and you'll notice the concentration on the kerchief wrapped around his mother's head. Great deal of attention as he focuses in on this, and other details as well of the physiology of the face, how the lips drape over the facial features and the intensity of those eyes. It's an attempt to resurrect the mother by repeating this image over and over and over again, almost talismanically, to make a very quick ellipsis, a break, to perhaps the most famous, certainly, work in this series, and one of the great drawings of the whole 20th century. There's a work in Chicago in this series. It's 24 by 18.5 inches, to give you a sense of scale, giving you these dimensions, otherwise it gets very distorting seeing them up there. It's a drawing in charcoal, pencil, and chalk. You get a real sense of how he's treating the sculptural possibilities of this face. It almost looks like Mount Rushmore in its monumentality, and here somewhat bloated up on the screen. But in particular, notice the sculptural treatment of the kerchief, how obsessively treated every one of those folds and curves and volumes are up here. But get a sense of how diligently he's working on all those forms. By 1936, he had developed a plan for a painting. This is 24 by 19 inches. And you'll see that it's squared for transfer, which is a technique by which, if you square a drawing, you can then blow up the drawing to larger squares on a larger sized canvas or another drawing. Here he's worked out a great many subtleties that differ significantly from the original photograph. And it would be difficult to get into them just now, except to say that this drawing no longer resembles the original photograph in some details. And that's easier to see in one of the versions of the painting that he did from it. This is the second of two versions of paintings that he did on this theme. This is 60 by 50 inches. So it's a little bit less than life size. And by now you can see details like the ledge have become very abstract. The figure of the mother has been flattened, somewhat flat, white shapes. The boy who was holding a bouquet in his hands that the photographer had undoubtedly placed there just holds some sort of pinkish gray form. There have been many subtleties introduced to make the shapes as harmonious and formally pleasing as possible. Up until this point in Gorky's career, he was using subject matter which he knew or imagined, or was close to him. There are other paintings of his family, as the base for a stylistic summation of everything he had learned in his apprenticeship to post-impressionism and before that impressionism. However, he was also able to use subject matter per se to advance his art. In particular, a work such as the one you see on the screen now is a painting called Garden in Sochi, dating from 1941. On the occasion of its acquisition by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Gorky handed them a sheet. They had asked for some explanation of what the picture is. As you can see, it's a completely abstract work that doesn't seem to be anything but a non-objective painting. And he wrote for them a rather lengthy text, for which I'll read you just the first couple of paragraphs. I like the heat, the tenderness, the edible, the lusciousness, the song of a single person, the bathtub full of water, to bathe myself beneath the water. I like Uccello, Grunewald, Ang, the drawings and sketches of Seurat, and that man Pablo Picasso. I measure all things by weight. I love my Magooch. This is the name he used for his wife, a derivation of Megredician. What about Papa Cezanne? I hate things that are not like me, and all things that I haven't got are God to me. Permit me. I like the wheat fields, the plow, the apricots, the shape of apricots, those flirts of the sun, and bread above all. About 194 feet from the house on the road to the spring, my father had a little garden with a few apple trees which had retired from giving fruit. There the ground was constantly in shade and grew incalculable amounts of wild carrots, and porcupines had made their nests. There was a blue rock half hidden in the earth, with a few patches of moss placed here and there like fallen clouds. But from where came all the shadows and constant battle like lancers in Paolo Uccello's painting? The garden was identified as the garden of wish fulfillment. Now, for 40 some odd years, this letter, this document, was considered to be a surrealist document, a fantasy of images that were conjured by Gorky to somehow accompany the painting in a metaphoric sense. The last section of that letter treats what was also thought to be a fantasy, which was the description of a tree on which people would pass by and rip off pieces of their clothes and tie it to it. And he said it was a poplar tree, and to his innocent ears the rustling of the leaves didn't mean anything. And the letter went on, and the document was placed in the files of the Museum of Modern Art, and it was quoted from time to time for 40 years thereafter, until very recently, when analysis revealed that the letter exactly described what's going on in this painting. Gorky's statement divides very clearly into two parts, each with a distinct tone, each with a different function. The first section, a gentle conjury, written in the present tense, catalogues his delights. The tone is dreamy and altogether winning. His art, his wife's love, domestic pleasures, fragrant odors, the bounty of a generous and tender land are all touched upon. Now, the pivotal image, as you may have guessed, is this holy tree bedecked with strips of cloth that rustle in the wind, in accordance with ancient Armenian custom. Tacitus makes reference to arboreal cults in Armenia, and even today the practice of attaching strips of clothing to trees continues with undiminished fervor, as attested by a recent photograph that was sent to me by Robert Thompson when he was traveling through Armenia, and just about knocked me off my chair when I was opening his letter. The significance here is that Gorky added a direct autobiographical detail, a detail that depicts previously unsuspected rites in the painting. Gorky notes the constant rustling of the leaves. That the rustling tree is harmonized in particular with the poplar tree was not whimsical. In fact, the more we look at the text, the less about it survives as happenstance. Divination by listening to the rustling leaves of the poplar is an Armenian practice that goes back at least to the 4th century pagan worship. So when Gorky refers to his innocent ear, what he may have meant was that his ears were innocent of the art of divination by listening to poplar trees. Gorky specifies that the tree he was listening to was a poplar, the most favorite tree of Armenia. And I'm sure you can all bear me out on this, which holds its place in Armenian life as does the cedar of Lebanon or the English oak. Gorky's sister recalled it was a custom of her family that at the birth of a son they would plant a poplar tree which would later have the birth date and name of the child carved on it. And as Gorky as a child loved the tree planted in his name and took great care in tending to it. The poplar became a very dear image for Gorky, and possibly this modern painting was commenting on one of Armenia's most revered customs, because in Armenian, as all of you know, and I only found out later, the poplar is sos, or sosi. And so he was not in fact describing a Russian town, Sochi, but was talking about gardens of Sochi, not Sochi, which means that this was one of the last attempts that Gorky made to pass himself off as a Russian without any hint to the knowledgeable about his Armenian roots. A Russian wouldn't have known anything about this, nor would an American certainly, but an Armenian would have figured it out. I'm not an Armenian, but I'm an art historian who had access to Robert Thompson, which makes us all very lucky. A sort of synergism happened. Now, from time to time, Gorky had used his Russian name in New York to gain access to New York society and New York art world. It was a very exalted name that gave him immediate credibility, we would call it today. His name was an entitlement to immediate and serious consideration. The name Gorky signaled an exile of aristocratic taste, which Gorky was, but he wasn't a Russian. Suggesting that Gorky had imbued this theme with special autobiographical references only raises the question of having to locate those references in what seems to be a miasma, a fata morgana. However, just to touch on this very briefly, this has all been done with some care in a larger context. If you look at this vertical form up on the right here, you see it's waving in the breeze. This is the poplar tree bedecked with strips of villagers' clothing. The mistranslation confusing a tree with the Black Sea Resort is more than the replacement of a locale for an object, and he eventually acknowledged his contrived pun. However, never publicly. He was never a public penitent, and Gorky only confided his intentions to his family. In a letter of 1940, Gorky wrote to his sister Bartush about the cloth trees of their youth, and in February 1942, he described the scene that prompted his paintings on this subject. Recall Father's garden down the path from our house and the tree of the cross, upon which authentic Armenian villagers attach the colorful pennants of their clothing. In my art, I often draw our garden and recreate its precious greenery and life. Can a son forget the soil that sires him? Now, this painting was not the only one on its theme. He worked on other themes that were associated with it, and the pun in the title Garden in Sochi is not the only example of Gorky's shifted meanings. He did another series of painting in which his hometown of Kouymjian was willfully misspelled as Zorkum, and what you see here is a painting from 1936 called Kouymjian Zorkum. Now, this town was the site of the Garden of Sochi, so-called, that is, Garden of Sochi. And if the Garden of Sochi series owed a principal debt to Miro, the late Catalan artist who just died this year, the Zorkum pictures seem to reflect an examination of the work of Max Ernst, the great surrealist painter. That Gorky's heritage was under examination in these works was not at all apparent, which is to say that neither art historians, nor other artists, nor critics, nor the general public, nor even, so far as I can discern, the Armenian community ever discerned in Gorky's work the actual sources for these pictures. By late 1943, Gorky may have attained sufficient confidence in himself as an artist to have begun contemplating the idea of revealing his actual sources. In a letter to his sister, to whom he reported regularly, Gorky wrote with a queer mixture of confidentiality and fantasy, "Bartush, dear, the series of paintings I spoke about deal with our garden in Armenia's Kouymjian. I named them Garden in Sochi, although in actuality I should really name them Garden in Kouymjian, and I believe I will, for that is what they are. The Americans, alas, are ignorant of Armenia, and I have been told they prefer names of places more popularly known." Well, he never did change the names of any of these pictures, nor did he ever reveal any of his sources. That was a momentary lapse of humility in a letter to his sister. It was only translated years later. Aside from such references to the geography of Armenia and the citation of his family, and particularly his mother, in earlier work, Gorky's art was evolving quite rapidly into that body of work that we know as the substance, the oeuvre of a master. It's only when we start looking at his mature work as an artist and distilling out the Armenian sources that we begin to get some sense of how he used his Armenianness in his art. In the 1944 work, that's 20 by 26 inches, pencil and crayon, called Good Afternoon, Mrs. Lincoln, without getting too involved in the subject matter, I'd just like you to look in the upper right, where you see the figure, a very elongated figure, of a woman who's got a long kerchief draped around her neck, very much like the figure of his mother in that photograph. Very traditional Armenian clothing. And whereas it's hard to discern, there's this other figure, very abstracted, holding out this red blob, you see. And if you remember that photograph, the child is holding out a little red bouquet to his mother. So this has become terribly abstracted. There's another figure cutting across the horizon here. Don't have to get too involved in it, but he keeps coming back to this. Also, he's evolving as a formal artist. This is an oil painting based on that drawing from 1944. It's 30 by 38 inches. And you see there, the figure on the left has got a blue smudge to indicate in an abbreviated way this blue heavy overcoat he was wearing. And there the kerchief of the mother trails off in the wind. That figure of his mother also appears in a very complex painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum. It's also from 1944, and it's called Water of the Flowery Mill. It's 40 by 48 inches, and the figure of his mother also appears here. It'll be very difficult for you to see from this large slide. It'll be easier to see if you take yourself to New York and look at the painting. And the figure is here. And if you look at it closely, I'll try to describe what's going on. That diagonal blue smudge is her right arm raised to her lips, and the purple is her kerchief, and the brown is the coat, and this white dress drapes to the floor. If you look at the face, which you can't see in this slide, it's painted in very clearly, nose, eyes, lips, and all that. Completely lost in this twined and braided color that drips down the picture very richly. For those of you who are somewhat familiar with the history of modern art, this work and the ones of this year may be the ancestors of what became stain painting, where the paint is set onto the canvas without an intermediary layer of paint so that it drips down the surface of the painting. Perhaps the single most important work of Gorky's career in terms of our ability to decipher his work, not necessarily in terms of his own sense of himself, derives from this image. It's a drawing for a painting called The Calendars. It's a study for the calendars. It's from 1946 and is 32 by 48 inches. And it's in the Fogg Museum, about a block from here, for those of you who'd like to examine it. Anecdotally, I might tell you that in my study of Gorky, I began with a fairly arcane theoretical problem about how does one visually organize abstract art, and decided to use Gorky as an example of how one organizes abstract art. And purely by luck, this drawing is in a public collection. It's in the Fogg. I spent 9 weeks, all day, every day, looking at this drawing, not knowing if there was anything in it, just making notes on the visual organization, turning it upside down, sideways, because who knew how the information was encoded if it was there? If any of you are art historians, you'll know what I'm talking about, and the rest of you will have to imagine. Drawing studies make surgeries look noisy. They are the quietest places on earth. People will come with magnifying glasses and sit for months at a time taking notes on a drawing. And here I had this giant drawing, and I was turning it upside down and sideways and getting the hairy eyeball from everyone, because I'd walk in and out of the room memorizing passages of this drawing, never really knowing what I was looking for. So it's pure happenstance that this drawing happened to be in a public collection. It's really the key. It's the Rosetta Stone to what Gorky was doing. We'll look at some details of it. They're important. This figure in the foreground here, I'll shut the light off for a second so you can see it more closely, is really the key. What it is a dog sitting on the floor. And here are its paws, and there's the black nose and the big floppy ears over the eyes. Ah, yes, recognition. Now, the important thing about this being a dog is not that Gorky liked dogs or that dogs were an important image. But once you know it's a dog, you know what the scale of the interior space is. You know that these are not mountains, nor are they atoms. You have a sense of what you're dealing with. You also know that this plane is a floor plane, because dogs don't generally go floating through space. Generally, they sit on floors. You also can guess that a line like this might represent the rear plane of that floor, and that everything behind that line will be on a vertical surface, like a wall, such as this line here tells you where the floor ends and the wall begins. Okay, so that figure gave scale and volume to the rest of the work. This figure, which will be somewhat hard to see, if you look at that little oval with the horizontal line, that oval with the horizontal line is the final evolutionary stage of Gorky's sign for woman's head. If you remember the drawing of his mother, it became simpler and simpler. Just a circle with a line around it. I'm sorry, I'm getting out of the way of the screen and probably screwing up the tape. That is his youngest daughter sitting in a wing chair. You see the top of the chair has two wings, looking out this square window at a mountain with the sun above it. And indeed, at this time, Gorky had married and was living in Connecticut with a woman with whom she bore two children, his wife, Agnes Magruder. And that figure is over here in the upper left. Finally, over on the right, to start with that oval sign with the line through it, you see it up there again, that's woman's head and her breasts, left arm, right arm. The left arm touches the top of a cradle as a baby, little kid wrapped up. And indeed, at the time of this drawing, they had just had their second child. On her left arm is Gorky's left arm, which goes way up, in fact, off the screen. But we'll look at it in a second. And he's reading a magazine. So in fact, what starts out looking like a terribly abstract, non-objective work of art that couldn't possibly have anything tangential to do with reality is in fact a picture of Gorky at home with his wife and their children in their living room, full of very rich details. Now this is the painting that evolved from that drawing and from many other drawings. You're getting a very compressed synopsis of this evolution. In the painting, it's even easier to tell what things are because the color describes natural reality. There's the dog with its brown fur and black nose. Mrs. Gorky's in a red blouse, and you see she's got a kerchief tied around her neck. You see the two black dependent lines. That oval in the middle is a fireplace, and you see the orange flames shooting up from that round log end, and there's even a little food duct control there. Show you how realistic all this is. Yellow sun pouring in through the window, and a rug, and this perspectively receding line. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is, this painting belonged to Nelson Rockefeller, who hung it in the New York State gubernatorial mansion, where it was incinerated in 1961 when that building burned to the ground. Right. The other bad news is that until a couple of years ago, as obvious as all this seems now, nobody could read this painting, and this picture was taken as the keystone upon which to build arguments for Gorky's spontaneity and surrealism. Okay, now what could be more natural for an Armenian man than to take immense pride in the establishment of his household after having lived through the Armenian Holocaust, the poverty and the immense poverty of being an artist that Gorky had to suffer. Here he was established in a home with his family, tremendous sense of pride. This image was used many times by Gorky as the basis for paintings. For example, just to show you how he used the same image to evolve other paintings, we're going to go rapidly through a couple of other examples. You see underneath the washes of paint, that same structure. And again, getting even more abstract. This is all that's left of his arm. That's all that's left of the dog, and so on. The point is that if we did not already possess the knowledge of what that picture represents, there'd be no possible way to retrieve its meaning from a work like this. That's why the fog drawing is the Rosetta Stone. Without it, there'd be no chance of ever having retrieved this information, since the calendar's painting was incinerated. And finally, he'd start playing with the forms themselves, giving them more elongated, playing with the shapes, changing them about. So that the artist, the formal modern artist, Arshile Gorky, would use the life of the man, Arshile Gorky, as the substance for all this material. Finally, about this picture, one note that's always been perplexing to me, and I'm going to use this opportunity to perhaps learn something from all of you. He left a memo about another work entirely, years earlier, in which he described in one passage the role of the calendar in Armenian culture. To this day, I've never figured out what he was talking about, but I'll read it to you, and perhaps some of you can tell me what it means. Gorky now speaks. In this culture where seasonal changes are forcibly abrupt, there was no need, with the exception of the Lenten period, for a formal calendar. In the ceiling was a round aperture to permit the emission of smoke. Over it was placed a wooden cross from which was suspended by a string an onion into which 7 feathers had been plunged. As each Sunday elapsed, a feather was removed, thus denoting the passage of time. That's the only record I can find in Gorky's writing to the word calendars, and it completely mystifies me. Another example of Armenianisms in Gorky's work is this picture, the second version of a painting called The Betrothal from 1947. And without getting into the iconography, that is, the imagery of the work, I'd like to point out that what you'll have to believe me is a female figure here wears this sort of pronged purple headdress in the middle of the picture. I suspect that represents the wedding crown placed on brides and grooms' heads very briefly during a wedding. There's another version of this. I wouldn't do that if I were you. That's a steel pole and it'll just slice the screen. There's another version of this painting, a newly discovered one that's shown up at Yale University, several forgeries that I've seen, and many original drawings. I think that's a good sign that Gorky's celebrity is now so great that there are forgeries showing up. Every couple of weeks I get one in the mail for authentication. Okay. Something else that might not be apparent is that in a work like this, as complex and abstract and non-objective as it appears, and indeed, as I said, Gorky's work is so pivotal to the history of 20th century art that virtually every post-war movement has tried to enlist Gorky as their ancestor. So seemingly non-objective is this, that a work like this one, for the longest time, was viewed as having no objective reference in the world. But if you look at that right-hand section of it, and we'll look at a detail, you see a woman pushing a baby carriage. There's that female head again. You see the oval head, and her right hand coming down, and there's the baby carriage. You see? And there she is walking through this landscape on the right. Well, I think we've made the case by now that Gorky was not thoroughly abstract and non-objective an artist, and he drew very heavily on his Armenian sources. He also drew on other sources, and as his life deteriorated, and I can't think of a calamity of human history that Gorky did not endure, perhaps not well, but his health failed, his marriage failed, his family, as we know, had been obliterated and scattered by the Holocaust. He had picked perhaps the wrong profession if he had sought security, but the right profession for us. We are the inheritors of all his genius. As his life deteriorated and unraveled, he began contemplating suicide, and in fact accomplished that terrible aim on the 21st of July, 1948. In the few days preceding his death, he had his friends read to him a favorite story of his, a short story by the Russian Anton Chekhov called The Black Monk. Gorky painted what was his last picture just before he died. And again, although it had not been suspected, this painting illustrates the story by Chekhov of the Black Monk. There is the Black Monk with the white bib, and around him is a much larger monk in outline, white with a black face. Exactly why that's so, it's hard to explain in a couple of minutes. The monk crosses a body of water. The monk is an apparition. And it may be hard to see this, but there's green here, and down below, he's floating across a bay, across the Black Sea, this apparition. And Gorky illustrated this tale of Chekhov's with sufficient accuracy to pinpoint the exact moment in the story that captured his interest. Because the death in the story, the death of the character Kouymjian, is more than a simple death. It's a virtual suicide at the end of a short and promising but failed life, much as was Gorky's a failed life in the sense of having never achieved public celebrity and never achieved the stability he wanted for himself and his family. In the last instant of his life, Kouymjian invokes the very things that animate Gorky's paintings, and he dies thinking that his racked frame, and Gorky was an immense man, 6'4", very powerful, can no longer support the energies of his vital genius. Surely this case with Kouymjian was the case for Gorky, and I'm going to read to you the last passages from the story, The Black Monk. Kouymjian cried to Tanya, that is the wife from whom he was separated, just as Gorky had just been separated from his wife. He cried to the great garden with its miraculous flowers, cried to the park, to the pines with their shaggy roots, to the rye field, cried to his marvelous science, to his youth, his daring, his joy, cried to the life which had been so beautiful. He saw on the floor before him a great pool of blood, and from weakness could not utter a single word, but from an inexpressible, infinite joy that filled his whole being. Beneath the balcony, the serenade was being played, and the black monk whispered to him that he was a genius, and died only because his feeble, mortal body had lost its balance and could no longer serve as a covering for genius. And indeed also in Gorky's life, natural glory, which he'd celebrated with his intricate drawings, did not desert him. Neither did his steadfast art fail. Like Kouymjian, Gorky's health had failed him when his huge, powerful body weakened and broke. It was Gorky's own life that had gone sour, abandoning life he might have felt that all living was a sham, but that his own life was irreparable. The world was not ending with Gorky's life, but he did not destroy his art. He bid farewell to his loved ones. Now, the critical point about all this is that when Gorky talks about loved ones, he's really talking about art, and he referred to his paintings and drawings as his loved ones. As I've hinted, Gorky was for the longest time considered a surrealist, and looking at these works, one could guess why he'd be considered a surrealist. Gorky himself never considered him a surrealist, although it was useful for him not to deny their mantle while he was alive and while the surrealists were in residence in the United States. They were a powerful group. However, in a letter to his sister, we get some sense of, one, what he thought of the surrealists, and two, what he meant by the phrase loved ones. And I'm going to quote now from a letter to Gorky, a letter from Gorky to his sister. The cleverists are not only the money kissers. There are cleverists among so-called artists. Truly sad. Beloved ones, surrealism is academic and is academic art under disguise and anti-aesthetic and suspicious of excellence and largely in opposition to modern art. Its claim of liberation is really restrictive because of its narrow rigidity. To its adherents, the tradition of art and quality mean little. They are drunk with psychiatric spontaneity and inexplicable dreams. These surrealists, these people are interesting to a limited extent. We do not think alike because their views on life are so different from mine, and we are naturally of an opposite background. Their ideas are quite strange and somewhat flippant, almost playful. Really, they're not as earnest about painting as I should like an artist to be. Art must always be earnest. Perhaps it is because I am an Armenian, and they are not. Art must be serious. No sarcasm, no comedy. One does not laugh at a loved one. Having severed himself from the surrealists, having identified his art as surrogates for the love of his missing family, what was Gorky's relationship to Armenia? Having said that his Armenian experience was the root of his aesthetic sensibility. In one of his last letters, I think Gorky answered that question. And I'm going to read from that letter. One must recognize that an Armenian in America is a strange thing indeed. That for us to contribute to art, we must grasp our experience. We are a race of poets. What I'm trying to say is that man speaks most authentically when he does so in his own speech, and his own speech is that which he has experienced himself. There is a place in this world for this Armenian feeling, for art is achieved when a man allows his particular tongue to become a universal, shared language by all. I respond to modern art as an Armenian from Van. Okay. We can talk about Gorky's influence on contemporary art history. It's massive. And those kinds of questions are art historical, and I have embraced them, and many others will continue to grapple with them. I think it's only for colloquia such as this that can begin to talk about and begin to address the substance of his Armenianism and Armenianism in the diaspora as that from which great art can bestow. And that is a question I cannot answer by myself, being not an Armenian, but a specialist in art history. And that is a question that can only come from colloquia, from dialogue with the specialists and the concerned Armenians that are in this room and in many other rooms like it around the world. And I suspect that the questions that will be forthcoming will help us clarify something of that, and I'll try to contribute what I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We have now time for some questions. Before I recognize any hands, The questions should be addressed to the two last papers that we heard, or either of them. And in the first instance, if either of the speakers wish to address the presentation of the other, I would certainly give you preference. If not, I saw a hand up here.
Dr. Rand, I know this is not a question, it's a point of information that might be useful to you. That regarding the sources, series, it dealt with the treaty in which rags are tied to it and so on. This is a tradition, as I found out, in the Middle East, and it has a significance, at least in the Arab world, in which immigrants have tied pieces of rag with essences of themselves on it to the trees and pledged to return, or in the hopes that it will return. I don't know if you knew that.
Well,
I wondered if it was important.
it is important, and in terms of my own research, I'd like to say two things. First of all, when I first realized that that text was not happenstance and was not a surrealist wordplay, which you have to understand, for 40 years, art historians dutifully reproduced this. In every book on modern art, you could find this text as an example of surrealism, right? As if it could not possibly refer to anything recognizable. When I first began to realize that not only were the pictures representational, but the texts that Gorky promulgated were also useful, I started looking for examples. Now, the first thing that happened was I went to Robert Thompson, and he said, of course, of course they do that. Then I started looking for a wider dispersion, and both to my delight and horror, delight as a scholar, horror as somebody who's trying to publish, I found the practice, please believe this, I have photographs, in areas as widespread as Japan and Ireland. Everybody apparently rips their clothes off and ties it to trees. Okay. Now the second point I want to make is one that I only made in passing. This man represents the most tremendous resource. I could not have done my work without him. And he has been almost invisible in these proceedings, except as an interlocutor for our contributions. But at critical points where no other resource was satisfactory, and I went to the Armenian community in New York and Armenian histories, and you all know how little is available of serious work in English. This man was pivotal. He could tell me what was there in Armenian culture that would be available to me in English, and then go back and find the classical sources. It's a great argument for the kind of thing you're doing today and for resources like Harvard in general. Yeah.
It's just that it represented, at least in the people that I know, a great nostalgia for their homeland and who they were and what they were. And I thought perhaps since he was Armenian, he
Yes. Well, he never did go back. Members of his family went back to Armenia on
No,
visits.
no, it doesn't mean that they do go back.
Oh.
I talk about,
I understand.
what the emotions that they have.
I think Mr. Armenian wanted to say something. And then...
I had experience. I knew Arshile Gorky, met him. My aunt was living on Dexter Avenue in Watertown, and one day I saw him 3 doors over visiting his sister. And I asked him if he would be willing to come and speak to the Armenian Student Association Boston branch. And he said he would be. And so we immediately established a meeting at 190 Beacon Street at the International Institute. We had a blackboard and we invited him to speak. He got up and the first thing he did was make a very beautiful profile, line profile of a beautiful girl. Then he took the eraser, he says, we don't do this anymore. He says, my camera does a better job in copy. What we try to do is penetrate and get the spirit of the thing, rather than merely a copy. I'll never forget that. It was his way of approaching surrealism or cubism or whatever it was. He was then.
Do you have a question about the paper, Mr. Armenian?
Well, it is with reference to the paper, he may be interested. I went to his studio at Union Square in New York, and we met. Anyway, you know that when he went to school, he took on the janitorship of the place, and he stayed inside the building to sleep because he had no place else to go. And on one occasion when he was sick, he didn't get up early enough to open the doors for the students to come in. They found out he slept there. They let him go, but when his professor was retiring that year, they asked him who would he recommend in his place, and he recommended Gorky.
Were there further questions? Did I see Lucy? No? Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. When I was in Armenia, people referred to the cloth on the tree and the kind of wish for having children, that women would tie those rags on. For that, I didn't know if anyone wanted to comment. The other question I wanted to ask was, what effect of the recent exhibit of Gorky's paintings that went all over this country has had on scholarship? In other words, are they now incorporating this kind of local attention to that kind of
It's very hard to answer that question with any humility, because the show had no effect on scholarship except as an appreciation of Gorky. What had an effect on scholarship was publishing the book from which this talk is excerpted, which is moving the lid off Gorky scholarship. Nothing that you heard today was known until the book from which it came was published. And there was a review in the New York Times at the time of the exhibition comparing the book published at the time of the exhibition with the exhibition, the book from which this talk comes, and the third work, essentially talking about what the relative merits of these documents were. I didn't plant that question.
I'm glad you answered it honestly.
Yes.
What would you say, Fred, is Gorky's position in relationship to the rest of abstract expression in this country? How would we account for the whole?
The question was, what is Gorky's relationship as a catalyst to the rest of abstract expressionism in the United States? Two ways to answer that. One is to say, absolutely crucial, absolutely pivotal. And the other one is much longer and talk about how it was pivotal. And that's a term. In fact, I thought it was a term. But to answer very briefly, he was the first of the New York School painters to come up with a formula by which you could work from specific autobiographical materials and generalize them to the point where you could have these images that would be evocative without being known. See? And that was a terribly important problem for American artists who had not produced an internationally important art, and because of things like the influence of Marx and the threat of fascism, were looking for a universality in their work. And that's what the word universal, a lot of what I wrote is very loaded by 30s dialogue, and you've got to really know the period fairly well to understand the connotations of those words. It fairly coruscates with meanings outside the simple one.
Yes.
I recently read the book by Carlo Duradio, the one that translates a lot of the letters. How valuable was that in your work? And
I don't read Armenian. It was critical.
So this is a translation.
The translation. It's a problem. For me, it was actually absolutely critical. What I read to you today of Gorky's letters comes from Muradian's translation. Again, that's the good news. The bad news is Muradian has never let anybody else see the letters, so we don't know if the translations are good translations or bad translations, if they're complete, if they've been altered, edited, bowdlerized. We have no idea what's in them. I just took the material that is in them, and since I knew that Muradian had no idea what's in the paintings, he couldn't have made up these references. Now, he might have deleted a lot of other material that's also useful, but I know he can make up any of these. And I was very selective in what I chose from the letters as illustration. Only those things that illuminate what's in the painting, because those sources were not known to him.
Yes, getting back to the theme of the conference, I wondered whether you would say that Gorky had a severe identity problem. He changed his name, he made his background. The early part of his career was an imitative of the great masters, Picasso, Kandinsky, Miro, and so on. And finally, at the point in his artistic career when he had found his own idiom, he took his life. Is there some...
Well, those are really two questions. And the first one, the answer is yes. That's the short one. Yes, the first question is simple. He had a tremendous identity problem, which may or may not have come from the circumstances of his upbringing. And one can speculate on that forever. He might have been just as wacky if he'd been brought up in Watertown and gone through all these changes. The second question is more interesting, or it's an implicit question, and it's far more painful to speculate on. And I'd like to lead you in this speculation with a comparison. What would Gorky's effect have been had he lived is implicit in your question. He did reach his mature style, his signature style, only shortly before he died. He would not have been that old a man were he alive today. He'd be 80, a venerable age, and perhaps he would have been with us. Which means that we've lost 40 years of Gorky's painting. That represents a great secret wound in the history of 20th century art and intellectual life. Because we know the nature of the man through this enormous volume of work that he turned out. He was not flippant, a word he used. And he was not casual about his art, which means he probably would not have succumbed to any of the passing fads. It's hard to imagine him saying, well, pop art is in, I'm going to do pop art, or now I'm going to become an op artist, or punk, so I'm just going to... It's clear that he would have progressed very methodically, very stalwartly, through the tenets of abstract expressionism, which means that today we would have alive with us, or we would have had the work of 40 years, of a mature abstract expressionist. Only de Kooning has lived that long. Recall that Rothko was a suicide, Pollock was a suicide, Klein died of a heart attack, David Smith died, and of all of them, Gorky was the forerunner. And the only thing to which I can compare it is that Richard Strauss lived into his 89th year, and Mahler, who I think is a superior composer, wrote all his major pieces within 10 years, between his 40th and 50th birthdays, and then died, getting every more attenuated in his tonality. And I'm sorry our musicologist isn't with us now. But 20th century music has been crippled by its inability to cross the hurdle of atonality. And I can only think, had Mahler lived with his dedication to psychological truth rather than theoretical doctrine, that transition might have been made in a way that would have altered and left uncrippled 20th century music. And the same thing I think is true for Gorky. And I think that was your implicit question.
Are there any further questions? Yes?
Yes, this is directed to Dr. Kouymjian. You would comment on this question. Saroyan seemed to have contemplated a larger question of what it means to be human. I wonder, did he use his search for his Armenian identity, or did he make his reflections on the Armenian character for that purpose, rather than to have searched for the meaning of his Armenian identity alone? Was an Armenian for him some type of universal land because of Armenian history and character development over the centuries? You will comment.
Saroyan said many times that being Armenian is no big deal. And he felt that, and he articulates it in his very last published work. That is the thing that he wrote near the end of his life, after he wrote Obituaries, which is basically on death and the process of death. He immediately sat down and wrote something so people won't think that he was only pessimistic in his attitudes. A little book called Births, in many respects a very unsatisfactory work, with a certain very unsatisfactory introduction that doesn't help us deal with the work at all. In Births, he makes it very clear in the opening sections of Birth that his birth as an Armenian in all birth is a pure accident and has no significant meaning. The fact that he was an Armenian was precisely an accident of this birth, and therefore there was no reason for him to feel either comfortable or uncomfortable about it, except if that being should feel comfortable or uncomfortable in the world that he or she was thrust into. Saroyan was a great universalist. It is not an accident that his first novel was called The Human Comedy, because he probably had in his mind the whole panorama, in the sense, the Balzacian sense of the Comédie Humaine, this great encompassing work. And he tried, as I suggested in my paper, to always see the entire universe, the macrocosm, in terms of the particular aspect of it, the individual, the microcosm. And since his own individuality was in fact by accident, but in fact the reality of being Armenian, and since he said so many times in his autobiographical works that we can never understand anything better than ourselves or any other person better than ourselves, then by plummeting to the depths of his being as an Armenian, he thought he was engaged in the exercise of learning what it was to be a human being in this one particular, which any human being could also mirror and reflect in their particular to see the paradigm of the entire universal structure. He was not a chauvinist. He was a nationalist, but one that kept that very secretly covered for himself. That is, he felt strong for his nation. That's what I meant by nationalist. And he certainly had no truck for people, and that's, I read that section to you about organizations and Armenian clubs and all that stuff, the public image. This abhorred him, and he stayed away from it. So, indeed, as I say, he felt it no great distinction to be an Armenian and didn't feel that Armenians were particularly better or worse than other people.
I wondered whether the chairman of our conference, Robert Myrek, would like to say a few words at the end. I think it would be a good presumption.
Mostly words of thanks to Robert Thompson and to our two remaining speakers today. I hadn't thought I was to speak. This has been an impressive gathering. It far surpasses what any of us had thought during the organizational period in terms of attendance, interest, but more than that, the kind of fascination with the topics that emerged. And I personally feel quite enriched by having sat through all of these sessions. And am very much impressed by the high level of preparation and thoughtfulness. We had a great debate about this last session, and there were some on the committee who, Robert Thompson and I were on one side, so he's here. He wasn't, and we really wanted the session, and there were some who said, well, you know, NAASR's about preserving Armenian identity. What's these artists, you know, you're not so sure about them. It was said quickly, and we straightened the person out. But our response was a response that I gave. Some words that I had heard earlier from Diana Derhovannesian, a distinguished poet who's in the audience today, and she had said, you know, when it's all gone and the culture is gone, what remains is the art. And it seems to me what's been demonstrated today in the work of Hovhannes and Saroyan and in Gorky is that the Armenian experience in America will live on forever. And I'm really sort of thrilled at the kind of presentations that were made. And I think it's really very fitting that we end on this note. Thank you very much.
Just an announcement, the reception is right next door and everybody is welcome.
Yes.